Hello, everybody. So for this video, this is kind of a follow-up to my previous video about the war in Europe. In this video, we're going to look at one of the most important elements of that war, which I didn't include in the previous video because I believe they deserve to be treated as their own separate discussion. And that is the Nazi campaign of extermination against European Jews and other groups that the Nazis had classified as undesirables that we today refer to as the Holocaust, which would ultimately claim the lives of more than 6 million European Jews, as well as 5.5 million other people that the Nazis had classified as undesirables, a group that included homosexuals, political dissidents, religious conscientious objectors, people with physical and mental disabilities, gypsies, some Slavs. Really, the list of people that the Nazis targeted is pretty extensive. But for our purposes, I'm going to mostly focus on the campaign against the Jews. Essentially, anti-Semitism is one of the bedrock principles of the Nazi philosophy, had been from the outset. The Nazis believed that Jewish people were responsible for much of the world's woes. They believed that Jews had, somehow conspired to cause Germany to lose the First World War. They believed that one of the reasons that Germany had lost furthermore was because of the dilution of the pure Aryan bloodline through the mixture with Jewish and other Untermenschen, as the Nazis referred to them, subhuman groups within Nazi society. So dealing with what the Nazis euphemistically referred to as the Jewish problem becomes a principal concern of the Nazis from the outset of the war. And this principally concerns Poland, which from the outset becomes one of the epicenters of the Nazi campaign of extermination against the Jewish population of Europe. And the reason is because Poland, prior to 1939, had the largest Jewish population in Europe. Fully 20% of the Polish population prior to 1945 was Jewish, more than 3.5 million people. When the Nazis take over Poland in the autumn of 1939, one of the very first things that they do is they order all of the Polish Jews living in the German-controlled areas. Of course, there's Soviet-controlled areas in the east at this point. They order all of the Polish Jews to come forward and identify themselves to the authorities, to register themselves with the authorities, the new Nazi authorities, that is, not Polish authorities. Once the Jewish population of Poland registers itself with the Nazis then start relocating the Jewish population of Poland, taking them out of the towns and cities and homes where they had lived, and placing them in specially created enclaves within Polish cities known as ghettos, where they were quite literally sealed off from the rest of the Polish population, in many cases literally walled off from the rest of the population. During this early phase of the war, the Nazis' attitude towards how to deal with Jews is somewhat ambivalent. They're not yet fully waging a war of extermination. And in this early phase of the war, the Nazis, basically their strategy for dealing with the Jewish problem, as they referred to it in Poland, was essentially to just neglect them, to keep them trapped in these ghettos, and to systematically deprive them of access to food and medicine, to starve them and to kill them through disease, which worked, albeit very, very slowly, as several 100,000 Jewish people ultimately died in the ghettos in this manner because of starvation and medical issues. But the Nazi campaign of extermination accelerates dramatically in June of 1941 when the Nazis invade the Soviet Union. The European part of the Soviet Union, European Russia, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, as well as the Ukraine, like Poland, contained significant Jewish populations. And when the Nazis advanced into the European part of the Soviet Union in the spring, early summer of 1941, oftentimes right behind their frontline units of infantry and armored units were special groups of the SS, um, the uh, the Nazi, the military wing of the Nazi Party, Schutzstaffel. And these specialized units, which were known as Einsatzgruppen, basically what they did is they went into villages and towns and cities in the Baltic, in Belarus, in Russia, in the Ukraine, oftentimes with the full cooperation of the local population, who were all too happy to tell them, in many cases, where the Jews lived. And they basically gather up all the Jewish people in these areas, and they then line them up in front of mass graves and machine gun them. They shoot them all and bury them in mass graves, sometimes as many as 20,000 at a time. And so this is how the Nazis basically waged their campaign of extermination in 1941 and into 1942. But it turns out that even the most hardened Nazis had a great deal of difficulty doing this. And psychological breakdowns, not to mention what the Nazis saw as the waste of bullets that could be used on their enemies, eventually leads to a reevaluation. In the winter of 1942, by which point the war is slowly beginning to turn against Nazi Germany, a meeting is held on the outskirts of Berlin at a mansion at Wannsee. And here, several key leaders of the SS, including Colonel Adolf Eichmann and uh, Reinhard Heydrich, the third highest ranking Nazi official in the Nazi government, who would eventually be assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in May of 1942. Um, Heydrich and, in particular, Eichmann eventually come up with what they call, euphemistically, the final solution to the Jewish problem. And it's at this point, after that Wannsee meeting, that the Nazis begin converting many of their concentration camps, like the massive concentration camp complex near Auschwitz in Poland, as well as other concentration camps like Birkenau and Treblinka and others, some of which are satellites of Auschwitz, as well as Dachau and Mauthausen and various others. And they basically convert these concentration camps, which had up to that point served as essentially slave labor camps, and they turned them into mass extermination centers. They began importing massive numbers of Jews from around Europe, from France, from the Netherlands, from Hungary, which is actually one of the last countries to have its Jews shipped to Auschwitz. And they basically exterminate them, killing the young children and most of the women, leaving only, and the elderly, leaving only those who are deemed healthy enough to still remain of service to the Reich. And through this mechanism of mechanized death, of sending these massive quantities of Jewish children and women and the elderly and men into these gas chambers, the Nazis at this point dramatically escalate the pace of their killings. Um, as the war eventually turns against the Nazis, they do begin trying to find ways to try to conceal the evidence of their vast crimes. This is one of the reasons why they begin operating those vast crematoria at Auschwitz and Birkenau and other concentration / extermination centers. And but the secret was out by this point. In fact, as early as 1942, the Allied High Command was aware of the mass extermination program that the Nazis were conducting at Auschwitz and other similar camps, thanks to reports that were smuggled out by the Polish underground um, during this time period. And ultimately, um, the question was the question was heavily debated on whether or not to bomb Auschwitz. Ultimately, Allied leaders decided not to bomb Auschwitz, fearful that they would accidentally kill large numbers of concentration camp inmates, and also feeling that it diverted attention from the war effort. This, needless to say, has because of this become one of the most contentious moral debates around the Allied war effort and around the Holocaust to emerge out of the Second World War. Um, but generally speaking, in spite of these sporadic reports, most people in the West, at least, weren't widely aware of the full scope of Nazi horror until American, Soviet, and British troops begin liberating concentration camps as they enter Nazi Germany and German t- and former Nazi occupied Poland in the winter and spring of 1945. And it's really only at this very last phase of the war, in the spring of 1945, that people in the wider world really become fully aware of the full scope of horror of the Nazi regime and just what evil they had been up to, the sheer scale of the evil that they had been involved in, and it's out of this that the decision is made to hold war crimes trials, holding the surviving Nazi leaders accountable, which commenced the following spring in Nuremberg, a city which was chosen as the site for the War Crimes Tribunal, trying high ranking Nazi officials, including the second in command of the Nazi government, Hermann Goering, who was also the commander of the Luftwaffe, as well as many other high ranking Nazi officials who had survived the end of the war. The stated reason for holding the Nuremberg trials was perhaps best summed up by the chief counsel, the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, American Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson. The crimes for which we seek to condemn are such that that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, for it cannot survive their being repeated. Ultimately, at Nuremberg and subsequent trials there and elsewhere, many thousands of Nazi officials are eventually tried, convicted, and in many instances executed for war crimes. However, it is worth noting that a sizable number, a disturbingly high number of Nazi war criminals ultimately managed to evade prosecution. Some did so by assuming assumed identities and escaping to friendly nations like Argentina, as was the case of Adolf Eichmann, who was eventually kidnapped in Argentina and brought back to Israel in 1961 to stand trial for his role as the architect of the final solution. Um, but many others were able to use other channels, simply hiding in plain sight, changing their names. About 1,600 or so Nazi officials were eventually brought to the United States, many of them preeminent Nazi scientists and industrialists, to participate in American weapons programs as a part of the Cold War, something known as Operation Paperclip. And so ultimately, it's estimated that as many as 90% of the people who were directly involved in the Holocaust ultimately escaped prosecution for their crimes. But to this day, even with many Nazis reaching incredibly advanced ages, you do still hear about people being tried for war crimes because, um, again, fundamentally, the purpose of that is never forget and to never let something like the Holocaust happen again. So yeah. So on that note, I'm going to leave you guys, and that concludes this video.